Hi everybody, thanks for connecting with me today. I hope that wherever you are and whenever you might be watching this, I hope that you've had a good week or a good weekend, whenever you're watching this. You might remember that 2 weeks ago, in our last video 2 weeks ago, that I began by telling you a story about a time in my life when I was going through a difficult time personally, and I had become very self-centered. The world had become a very small place. Remember we talked about that? And I told the story about how worship helped to change the trajectory of my vision. It helped me to elevate my gaze to not just see the world through the lens of me and my experience, but to see the beauty of Jesus and his power and his glory, and it just changed my perspective. Well, I told you that story for a specific reason, because I think that stories are very powerful tools. Stories are very powerful tools to communicate truth, right? And to help us wrap our head around, truth. And of course, the Bible is full of stories. In fact, you might remember that last summer we did a whole summer series on Old Testament stories and the life lessons that we could learn, from that. Well, this summer, today, we're starting a new summer series, and this summer we're doing another series built around stories. But this time we're talking about stories that Jesus told. In fact, we're talking about the parables of Jesus in this series. Now, parables, of course, are different than real life historical stories, about whatever, Moses or David or whatever. Parables are different than real life historical stories. But they're built around real life, right? They're not historical, but they're built around real life. So in other words, when Jesus told the story about a farmer planting seed or scattering seed, I don't know if Jesus had a specific farmer in mind. Like I saw John out planting his seed today, but we all understand that seed, when it falls or it's planted in different kinds of soil, that's a real life scenario, right? So parables are not historical true life stories, but they are life stories. Did I make even sense with that? But the thing is about parables is that they're very simple stories. They're simple and memorable stories that really carry profound life truths, right? They're simple stories and they're memorable stories. A person who maybe doesn't know too much about God and the Bible, whatever, but there's a good chance that they remember the story, or they have some idea of the story of the Good Samaritan, for example. And there's a good chance that a person, has a general idea that the story of the Good Samaritan had to do with helping people, right? Or helping strangers, or stopping on the side of the road, right? So these parables are simple stories, they're memorable stories, and they contain really profound, significant truths. So in the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are 33 different stories that are captured that Jesus told. And in fact, it's kind of interesting actually that John doesn't tell any of the parables of Jesus, but Luke is like the parable champion. Luke, out of the 33 different stories that Jesus told, the parables, over half of them are unique to Luke. Luke loved telling the parables, that Jesus told, and I'm not sure why that is, but yeah, there are 33 different stories that Jesus told, parables that are captured in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Before we jump in to our parable for today about the rich fool, I'd like to just address this question of why did Jesus use parables, right? Why did he tell parables? And we might think that the answer is to illustrate a truth, which we just talked about. And there certainly is truth in that, I think, that it's a great way to illustrate what you're talking about. But in Luke chapter 8, Jesus is talking to his disciples, And Jesus gives a surprising answer to why he told parables. In Luke chapter 8, verse 9, he said, Luke says that his disciples asked him what this parable meant. And he replied in verse 10, you are permitted to understand the secrets of the kingdom of God, but I use parables to teach the others so that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Listen to this. When they look, they will not really see. When they hear, they won't understand. Isn't that an interesting statement? Jesus said again, but I use parables to teach the others so the scripture might be filled. When they look, they won't really see. When they hear, they won't understand. So Jesus used parables to communicate truth, right? And so for most people, they'll hear this nice little story, simple but memorable story. Most people will hear the story and give it kind of a cursory glance. They'll maybe give a little bit of thought, but not really too much thought, and then they'll go on and live their lives, right? But Jesus said that for those who have, using the language of Revelation, for those who have ears to hear, for those who have ears to hear, who are tuned into what the Spirit is saying, those who hear these stories will actually pause and ponder and actually think about the story and listen to the voice of the Spirit as He's speaking to us. But so those of us will pause and ponder and actually ask ourselves, how do I apply this to my life? What difference does this simple little story actually make in my life? And I think we're going to see this illustrated in our story today about the rich fool. So in Luke chapter 12 is where we find our story today. And this story is set up by a guy who it seems, as Luke tells the story, it just seems the guy just appeared kind of out of nowhere. And the guy asked Jesus to settle a family dispute, right? In verse 13, it says, then someone called from the crowd, this guy, teacher, please tell my brother to divide our father's estate with me. Doesn't this seem like a strange thing? If you're reading through the Bible, the book of Luke, and then just all of a sudden this guy like, hey, Jesus, tell my brother to settle our family dispute, right? And it seems like a really weird thing, especially for Luke to capture in this. But it actually wasn't a weird thing because it was very common for rabbis in the day to settle these kinds of disputes. The rabbis kind of using their biblical wisdom and they were often called on to settle these kinds of disputes. And so in this place as a rabbi, it was very normal for this guy to say, hey, Jesus, Rabbi, can you, please settle this dispute, this family dispute, over my father's inheritance. But Jesus didn't weigh in on. He's like, I'm not going to touch that. He didn't weigh in on on this family dispute. But as we read between the lines, Jesus did weigh in on this guy's underlying motive, maybe, of greed. There you go. There's a plot twist. So, verse 13 again. Someone calls out from the crowd, teacher or rabbi, please tell my brother to divide our father's estate with me. And the implication is that the brother is the one who's being greedy, right? And not being fair with me. But verse 14, Jesus replied, friend, who made me judge over you to decide things like that? And then he said, beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own. Isn't that a plot twist? So Jesus is like, I'm not going to weigh in on your family dispute, on your father's estate, but friend, beware, be careful, guard against every kind of greed, for life is not measured by how much you own. So greed, of course, or another word that's used in the Bible is covetousness. Greed is the desire to have more than we actually have, right? Greed is the position, the posture within ourselves of more, more, more. If I can just have more, then maybe I'll be happy. And Jesus was cautioning this guy. Jesus wasn't trying to rain on the guy's parade by saying, hey, you're being greedy and you're like, no, Jesus was actually in love trying to caution this guy. He was trying to help him. He was trying to help him. Friend, beware. Beware, guard against, every kind of greed. And then Jesus goes on to tell this parable, and this is what we're focusing on today. Verse 16, then he told them a story. A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. He said to himself, what should I do? I don't have room for all of my crops. And then he said, I know, I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And then I'll have room enough to store all my wheat and other goods. And then I'll sit back and say to myself, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, you will die this very night. And then who will get everything you worked for? Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. Do you remember that I said about why parables, that the real thing about parables is that we would pause and ponder and ask ourselves, what kind of life lessons can I learn from this story? And what life lessons can I actually apply to this story to help me become, a better person? So can I just highlight 4 things that I see in this story? And again, on Sunday, I think it'll be really interesting to hear your perspective on this story and what stands out to you. But here are 4 life lessons that I think that stand out to me from the story. The first one we've already touched on, and it's when Jesus put his finger on greed. He said, beware of greed, right? And listen to me, the main issue here is not the size of your barn, right? Jesus didn't, in verse 16, the rich guy had a fertile farm, and there's nothing wrong with having a fertile farm. There's nothing wrong with having lots of crops, right? So whether figuratively or literally in the case of some of our people in our community who are food producers. There's nothing wrong with having a large crop, right? And so the issue is not the size, or the issue here is not wealth or the size of your barn. The issue is, listen to me, our attitude towards the barn and our attitude towards getting bigger barns and more wealth, right? And so Jesus is guarding against, or cautioning against greed. Okay, let's move along. The second thing that I see here is guarding against self-centered consumption. Guarding against self-centered consumption. Look in verse 22. Jesus said, that's why I tell you not... I skipped down. Verse 19. Guarding against self-centered consumption, verse 19. Look at the guy's posture here, his attitude. He says, I'll sit back and I'll take it easy. And these famous words, eat, drink, and be merry, right? Self-centered consumption. His response to having big barns and a great crop wasn't to bless others, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But not blessing others, but self-centered consumption, right? And boy, that speaks to me personally. That speaks to me. And it speaks, I think, to our culture of self-centered consumption. So what do we do with that? The third thing I see here is actually after this story in verse 22 that we didn't read, but Jesus goes on in verse 22 and he says, that's why I tell you not to worry about everyday life, your food, your clothing, right? And the life lesson that we learned here is not to worry about our stuff. The crazy thing is that the bigger, using the analogy, the illustration of this story, the bigger the barn, then we would think that we would have to worry less, right? Because we have lots of money, we have a big barn full of crops. But actually, the bigger the barn, then the bigger the worry, right? We tend to worry more about the stuff that we get when we get more stuff, right? It's counterintuitive and it's counterproductive, right? And Jesus is saying in verse 22, guard against worry. Guard against worry. So the first lesson that I think Jesus was saying is guard against greed. Greed just leads to an unhealthy and unhappy life. The second lesson, guard against self-centered consumption. With your big barn, with your wealth, have an open hand of generosity. The third lesson is to guard against worry. And then the final thing, and I think the main lesson, Jesus's main point is to be rich in relationship with God. This is the real point of what Jesus was getting at. It was the punchline in both verse 21 and verse 31. The punchline of Jesus's parable, yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. A person is a fool to store up earthly wealth and not have... Now, he didn't stop, a person is a fool to have earthly wealth. That's not what he was saying. A person is a fool to store up earthly wealth and, and all the things we talked about, self-centered consumption and that kind of thing, but not have a rich relationship with God. And then in verse 31, seek the kingdom of God above all else, and he'll give you everything that you need. Right? So Jesus is teaching here about material wealth. And actually, Jesus taught a lot about material wealth. He had a lot to say about what we do with our stuff. Okay, so I need to wrap up. And on Sunday, the 4 questions that we're going to ask are really centered around those 4 life lessons. Let me read them quickly and ask you to ponder these questions. Do I sometimes have a more is better attitude towards money and stuff? Do I have a more is better attitude? And this speaks to the issue of greed, accumulating stuff. Second question, how do I use my resources? Do I have an open hand of generosity? Boy, that's a challenging question, isn't it? Third question, do I worry about my stuff? There's a simple but profound question. And then the fourth question, does my attitude towards my stuff help me grow in my relationship with God? Wow, those are some really significant and really difficult questions. And so friends, if you're watching this if you're going to be with us on Sunday and you're watching this before we have our conversation, I would encourage you that today, that maybe it's on Saturday or Sunday morning, but I would encourage you to really give some thought to these questions, some soul-searching thought, and actually, pause and ponder these things, and we'll have a conversation, about it tomorrow if you're watching this on Saturday. Okay, so I need to wrap up. Thanks for connecting with me today, and if you're able to, we look forward to meeting you tomorrow for breakfast at Latcham Hall at 10 o'clock, and then our worship and conversation will start at 10:30. God bless you, friends. Have a great day.